Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 12. We'll be discussing agency records, content analysis, and secondary data. Now, agency records, secondary data, or content analysis, they all do not require direct interaction with research subjects. Now, there are three different approaches to using information that has been collected by others, often as a routine practice. So, firstly, data is collected by federal, state, or local agencies because they have the infrastructure to do it, the budget, the time, the people. Two, social artifacts, right? Written documents or other types of messages. And three, right? I guess if you look at it that way, information collected by others is frequently used in criminal justice research, so always something to note. Other points. Secondary analysis. It's an analysis of information collected by others. Secondary data can still be considered obtrusive, so please keep that in mind. And in a general sense, most data you obtain from agency records or research projects conducted by others are secondary data. Now let's look at using agency records. They supply a wide variety of uses in research applications. Data from agency records or archives, they most likely have originally been gathered in a number of ways, from sample surveys all the way to direct observation. That's going to make some more useful than others depending on your research objective. Published statistics and agency records are most commonly used in descriptive or exploratory studies. Agency records are frequently used in applied studies as well. Now, topics appropriate to research utilizing content analysis center on important links between things like communication, perceptions of crime problems, um, individual behavior, criminal justice policy, things of that sort. Research data collected by other investigators through surveys or field observations may be used for a broad variety of later studies. And there's also existing data that may also be considered as a supplemental source of data. Now, the key to distinguishing appropriate and inappropriate uses of agency records, content analysis, and secondary data is basically couched in understanding how these written records are produced. All right, let's look at agency records. Researchers use a variety of published statistics and non-public agency records. Information is collected by or for public agencies, which usually falls into one of three general categories: published statistics, non-public agency records routinely collected for internal use, and new data collected by agency staff for specific purposes. All right, let's first look at published statistics. Now, there are compilations of data which most government organizations routinely collect and publish, and there are several examples of either agencies, or I guess agencies and the data that they publish. So the Census Bureau publishes a lot of data. The National Crime Victimization Survey is very popular in the field of criminal justice. The FBI publishes a lot of data as well. The Administrative Office of U.S. Courts publishes a lot of data. The Federal Bureau of Prisons publishes. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, another great place, help publish the criminal victimization statistics in the United States. Most comprehensive publications on criminal justice data is usually done annually by these agencies, and also the source book on criminal justice statistics. Now, many data sources are summary data, right? Which means that they're basically highly aggregated. And data that is presented in a highly aggregated form cannot be used to analyze the individuals from or about whom the information was originally collected, right? Because you're going from precise to more broad, or in other words, refined to unrefined, which is okay to make generalized statements, but not statements about an individual. Now, this cannot be utilized, of course, to reveal information about any individual items, even if they may have been a part of that sample size. Um, Published data can therefore address questions about highly aggregated patterns or trends. Drug use in crime, the covariation of two estimates of crime, um, maybe change in fatal violence. This is all things that they can study. they have the distinct advantage of being readily available in electronic format. You can go online, take a minute or two, and you should be able to find most data. Um, the electronic formats themselves have a lot of advantages. Data fields may be basically read ready, right? For a lot of statistical and graphic based programs that allow them to be utilized in a lot of statistical analyses, which lend large published statistic data sets very valuable for quantitative analysis. Now, before using either original data or tabulations from published sources, researchers must consider the issues of validity and reliability and the more general question of how well the data that they collected meet specific research purposes. Another useful tool that researchers can utilize is non-public agency records. Now, most criminal justice organizations will make such data available to criminal justice researchers. It's just important to know that compromises are there within the data, even if it does appear very comprehensive. Keep in mind that different agencies have different procedures and standards for how data is collected. Some useful examples, right? Child abuse, delinquency, adult arrest, crime hotspots, uh, all great examples, right? Now, agency records can be utilized as measures of decision making, right? One thing to note, expect the unexpected. If unexpected findings or patterns emerge, you should take it upon yourself to review data collection procedures once again before accepting the unexpected, because once again, these are non-agency records. All right, let's look at new data sets that are generated for specific research purposes, typically internal, usually by, an agency staff member. Firstly, we have a hybrid source, which combines the collection of new data through observations or interviews with day-to-day criminal justice agency activities. There are two main advantages of utilizing data like this. One, it is much less costly than fielding a team of research assistants, and there's more control over the measurement process than we would have if we just relied on agency definitions, right? Because you have a more granular control here, at least the person in the agency staff who's doing it for you, right? Or if they did it themselves and you're utilizing their data in the form of secondary data, they have a greater refinement over the definitions there. What are some of the disadvantages? You need to obtain cooperation of the organization and the staff there. And two, researchers have less control over the data collection process when they rely on agency staff, right? There's also errors that can happen. All right, so when you start to conduct your analysis and you're trying to define your sample, it's important to note that even though you have access to a lot of great data that's public, or perhaps maybe you're getting it from a non-public agency, but you still are able to get buy-in, or if you collaborated with an agency staff member and you got buy-in from the organization, regardless of how you got the data, and you're trying to combine multiple data sets. Remember, if you use agency records, please be attentive to match or mismatch between units of analysis. Sometimes it's going to be appropriate for your research question, and other times it's not going to be, right? Sometimes it could be represented in an aggregate unit and sometimes in an individual unit. This is important here because, as we recall, it is possible to move from individual to aggregate units of analysis, but not the other way around. Units of analysis are not uniform between criminal justice agencies. Different agencies have different means of keeping track of things or different accounting techniques. However, once you do this and you start sampling, you realize that it should be relatively simple. Sometimes they will already have a target population identified, which makes the research process for you easier. And you just have to be aware of potential biases within that already specified sampling frame. All right. Take a few seconds here, hit the pause button, and examine the units of analysis in criminal justice data. Look at how you can measure criminal activity in various different ways, court activity, apprehension, and even experiences within corrections. All right, let's re-examine some reliability and validity issues. So understanding the details of how agency records are produced is the best guard against reliability and validity problems. Now, the key to evaluating the reliability and validity of agency records, as well as the general suitability of those data for a research project, is to understand as completely as possible how the data was originally collected. Potential errors can be revealed by scrutinizing source notes. There can be numerable, right, stuff. So firstly, clerical errors. Very common. People do typos all the time. This may be detected and reported in correction notices, which are essentially amended in later reports. There could be changes in data collection procedures or changes in operational definitions of key indicators. This is most likely to occur in data series that extend over several years. As the time interval under investigation increases, so does the potential for a change in measurement. Now, researchers who analyze criminal investigation data produced by different cities or states or jurisdictions must be alert to the variations in the definitions of measurement of key variables. It's also important to realize that if enough changes within how a variable is being measured, even if it has the same name, collected by the same agency, it's a different year, it may not even be appropriate to compare the two. Um, it's better to look at the trend in percentage increase and decrease. So what are some sources of reliability and validity issues? Social production of data, right? Decisions by criminal justice personnel may not be completely objective. Data can reflect organization processes and decisions in addition to the condition being measured. There can be discretionary actions by criminal justice officials and others that affect the production of virtually all agency records. Agency data is not designed for research usually. It's not what it's intended to be used for. So data that's being collected basically because the law requires them to do so. Agencies tend to collect data for their own use, right? Not for the use of researchers. So research may need to be congruent with the agency's record-keeping practices. Conceptual and operational definitions of key concepts, however thoughtful and precise, will seldom be identical to the actual measures maintained by criminal justice agencies. So you might have to use a lot of proxy measures there. Um, Also, consider tracking the fact that some agencies are tracking people, not patterns, right? So people, not patterns. At the operational level, officials generally are more interested in keeping track of individual cases than examining patterns. Record keeping systems used in most cities today are still designed more to track individual cases for individual departments than to produce data for management or research. There's also the fact that sometimes data can be siloed, right? There's stacks of data that are isolated from each other. And there can be errors which always increase with volume. The potential for clerical errors increases as the number of clerical entry increases, especially troublesome for studies of relatively rare crimes or incidences. So if you were put in charge of a federal government agency like the FBI, and they asked you if you would like to revamp the way that they distribute data, like the UCR or the NIBRS, and they say, would you like us to center our research collection around individual cases or around crime patterns, right? What would you say? All right, let's look at content analysis. Now, this is a systematic study of messages and the meaning those messages convey, and it may be applied to virtually all forms of communication. What are some possible artifacts? Books, magazines, films, songs, speeches, television programs, letters, laws. And content analysis is extraordinarily good at answering classic questions of communications research, right? So the who says what, to whom, why, how, and with what effect. All right, now coding in content analysis. Coding represents the measurement process in content analysis. This involves the logical conceptualization and operationalization of concepts that is found. Typically involves interaction of theoretical concerns and empirical observations. You are trying to identify the manifest and latent content. The manifest content is a visible surface content, and the latent content is the underlying meaning. What you're trying to do in the basis form of coding and content analysis is you're trying to identify the themes and then define them, right? Conceptualization and then operationalization. Something to keep in mind when coding and content analysis, there is no coding scheme which should be used unless it has been carefully pre-tested. Reliability in content analysis can readily be tested in two related ways. One, inter-rater reliability, right? Have two different people code the same passage and then computing the proportion of the items coded the same, right? Basically, having someone else replicate the same work you did. And there's a test retest method, which one person codes the same passage twice. Now, here's one great example of a content analysis, which is the Global Terrorism Database, which is basically the one-stop shop for most people looking at aggregate incidences of terrorism, which can be disaggregated to the country and sometimes smaller units within the country, but never to the individual. They have a pretty broad screening criteria, which results in almost 400,000 possible articles a month to be examined to see what can be coded as terrorism and what cannot be. And it's important to note that sometimes there's several articles on the same incident, right? Now, content analysis software winnows them down to roughly 16,000 articles a month, and 6 teams of coders review for further screening and coding. Let's now examine another example from Thompson and Henniger's study in 2001, where they sampled 55 and over 600 E-rated games. Now, experienced undergrad gamers played for 90 minutes or until the game reached a natural conclusion. An experienced gamer slash researcher and undergrad gamer reviewed videotape of gaming sessions. And essentially, what they found was that they all tried to code the number of violent incidences, the number of deaths, drug, alcohol, tobacco, profanity, sexual behavior, weapons, explicit music, and essentially they measured the duration of violent acts and the number of deaths to length of game playing for standardized measures. And the whole purpose of this was they wanted to see if those two, one being an experienced gamer and the other one being experienced gamer slash researcher, and the other one being an undergrad gamer to see if they coded in the same manner. All right, and lastly, looking at another example of content analysis is a famous 1999 study about how gang membership might facilitate homicide in different ways. There is a content analysis of police files for homicide in St. Louis over a 10-year period. And from that, they were able to classify two different types of gang killings, right? They had gang motivated killings, which resulted from gang behavior or relationships such as an initiation ritual, the throwing of gang signs, or a gang fight. And this was in contrast to gang-affiliated homicides, which involved a gang member as victim or offender, but with no indication of specific gang activity. All right, now let's look at secondary data. Secondary data is data collected by other researchers and are often used to address new research questions. This has become an increasingly important tool for several reasons. One, there's a high cost to collecting original data through surveys or other means. So it's cost effective. Two, data for secondary analysis is readily available, so it's easy to get and it's basically free. Sources of secondary data, right? First, you have the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, the ICPSR. This is basically a central repository of machine readable data collected by social science researchers. There's also the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data, which is established by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in cooperation with the ICPSR. Now, what are some advantages to secondary data? Of course, as I already said, it's cheaper and it's faster than collecting original data. And you might benefit from the work of basically well-seasoned professionals and esteemed academics collecting the data, right? They may have thought of questions that you did not think of when you were conceptualizing your research idea. What are some of the disadvantages? Is recurrent questions of validity. Whether secondary data provides valid measures of variables you want to analyze is still left to be seen, right? Secondary data are least useful for the evaluation studies, right? Evaluations are designed to answer specific questions about specific programs. Secondary data cannot be used to evaluate an entirely different program, right? You were at the mercy of the way that the researchers who collected the data organized the questions and their formats, the way that they conceptualized the questions, the manner in which they collected them, right? You're all at the mercy of secondhand data. All right, so I want you to think back. Have you ever worked with secondary data? And if the answer is yes, what was your experience? Now, with this being said, I am going to bring this to an end. I'd like you to take care and enjoy the rest of your week.